Francis Bacon. From Aristotle to the Renaissance. When Sparta blockaded and defeated Athens towards the close of the 5th century BC, political supremacy passed from the mother of Greek philosophy and art, and the vigor and independence of the Athenian mind decayed. When, in 399 BC, Socrates was put to death, the soul of Athens died with him, lingering only in his proud pupil, Plato. And when Philip of Macedon defeated the Athenians at Chaeronea in 338 BC, and Alexander burned the great city of Thebes to the ground 3 years later, even the ostentatious sparing of Pindar's home could not cover up the fact that Athenian independence, in government and in thought, was irrevocably destroyed. The domination of Greek philosophy by the Macedonian Aristotle mirrored the political subjection of Greece by the virile and younger peoples of the north. The death of Alexander, 323 BC, quickened this process of decay. The boy emperor, barbarian though he remained after all of Aristotle's tutoring, had yet learned to revere the rich culture of Greece, and had dreamed of spreading that culture through the Orient in the wake of his victorious armies. The development of Greek commerce and the multiplication of Greek trading posts throughout Asia Minor had provided an economic basis for the unification of this region as part of an Hellenic empire. And Alexander hoped that from these busy stations Greek thought, as well as Greek goods, would radiate and conquer. But he had underrated the inertia and resistance of the Oriental mind and the mass and depth of Oriental culture. It was only a youthful fancy, after all, to suppose that so immature and unstable a civilization as that of Greece could be imposed upon a civilization immeasurably more widespread and rooted in the most venerable traditions. The quantity of Asia proved too much for the quality of Greece. Alexander himself, in the hour of his triumph, was conquered by the soul of the East. He married, among several ladies, the daughter of Darius. He adopted the Persian diadem and robe of state. He introduced into Europe the Oriental notion of the divine right of kings, and at last he astonished a skeptic Greece by announcing, in magnificent Eastern style, that he was a god. Greece laughed, and Alexander drank himself to death. This subtle infusion of an Asiatic soul into the wearied body of the master Greek was followed rapidly by the pouring of Oriental cults and faiths into Greece along those very lines of communication which the young conqueror had opened up. The broken dikes let in the ocean of Eastern thought upon the lowlands of the still adolescent European mind. The mystic and superstitious faiths which had taken root among the poorer people of Hellas were reinforced and spread about, and the Oriental spirit of apathy and resignation found a ready soil in decadent and despondent Greece. The introduction of the Stoic philosophy into Athens by the Phoenician merchant Zeno, about 310 BC, was but one of a multitude of Oriental infiltrations. Both Stoicism and Epicureanism, the apathetic acceptance of defeat and the effort to forget defeat in the arms of pleasure, were theories as to how one might yet be happy though subjugated or enslaved, precisely as the pessimistic Oriental Stoicism of Schopenhauer and the despondent Epicureanism of Renan were in the 19th century the symbols of a shattered revolution and a broken France. Not that these natural antitheses of ethical theory were quite new to Greece. One finds them in the gloomy Heraclitus and the laughing philosopher Democritus. And one sees the pupils of Socrates dividing into Cynics and Cyrenaics under the lead of Antisthenes and Aristippus, and extolling the one school apathy, the other happiness. Yet these were even then almost exotic modes of thought. Imperial Athens did not take to them. But when Greece had seen Chaeronea in blood and Thebes in ashes, it listened to Diogenes. And when the glory had departed from Athens, she was ripe for Zeno and Epicurus. Zeno built his philosophy of apatheia on the determinism which a later Stoic, Chrysippus, found it hard to distinguish from Oriental fatalism. When Zeno, who did not believe in slavery, was beating his slave for some offense, the slave pleaded in mitigation that by his master's philosophy he had been destined from all eternity to commit this fault. To which Zeno replied, with the calm of a sage, that on the same philosophy he, Zeno, had been destined to beat him for it. As Schopenhauer deemed it useless for the individual will to fight the universal will, so the Stoic argued that philosophic indifference was the only reasonable attitude to a life in which the struggle for existence is so unfairly doomed to inevitable defeat. If victory is quite impossible, it should be scorned. The secret of peace is not to make our achievements equal to our desires, but to lower our desires to the level of our achievements. If what you have seems insufficient to you, said the Roman Stoic Seneca, who died 65 A.D., then, though you possess the world, you will yet be miserable. Such a principle cried out to heaven for its opposite, and Epicurus, though himself as stoic in life as Zeno, supplied it. Epicurus, says Fenelon, bought a fair garden, which he tilled himself. There it was he set up his school, and there he lived a gentle and agreeable life with his disciples, whom he taught as he walked and worked. He was gentle and affable to all men. He held there was nothing nobler than to apply oneself to philosophy. His starting point is a conviction that apathy is impossible, and that pleasure, though not necessarily sensual pleasure, is the only conceivable and quite legitimate end of life and action. Nature leads every organism to prefer its own good to every other good. Even the Stoic finds a subtle pleasure in renunciation. We must not avoid pleasures, but we must select them. Epicurus, then, is no Epicurean. He exalts the joys of intellect rather than those of sense. He warns against pleasures that excite and disturb the soul, which they should rather quiet and appease. In the end, he proposes to seek not pleasure in its usual sense, but ataraxia, tranquility, equanimity, repose of mind, all of which trembles on the verge of Zeno's apathy. The Romans, coming to despoil Hellas in 146 BC, found these rival schools dividing the philosophic field, and having neither leisure nor subtlety for speculation themselves, brought back these philosophies with their other spoils to Rome. Great organizers, as much as inevitable slaves, tend to Stoic moods. It is difficult to be either master or servant if one is sensitive. So such philosophy as Rome had was mostly of Zeno's school, whether in Marcus Aurelius the emperor or in Epictetus the slave. And even Lucretius talked Epicureanism stoically, like Heine's Englishman taking his pleasures sadly, and concluded his stern gospel of pleasure by committing suicide. His noble epic On the Nature of Things follows Epicurus in damning pleasure with faint praise. Almost contemporary with Caesar and Pompey, he lived in the midst of turmoil and alarms. His nervous pen is forever inditing prayers to tranquility and peace. One pictures him as a timid soul whose youth had been darkened with religious fears, for he never tires of telling his readers that there is no hell except here, and that there are no gods except gentlemanly ones who live in a garden of Epicurus in the clouds and never intrude in the affairs of men. To the rising cult of heaven and hell among the people of Rome, he opposes a ruthless materialism. Soul and mind are evolved with the body, grow with its growth, ail with its ailments, and die with its death. Nothing exists but atoms, space, and law, and the law of laws is that of evolution and dissolution everywhere. No single thing abides, but all things flow. Fragment to fragment clings. The things thus grow until we know and name them. By degrees they melt and are no more the things we know. Globed from the atoms, falling slow or swift, I see the suns, I see the systems lift their forms, and even the systems and their suns shall go back slowly to the eternal drift. Thou too, O earth, thine empires, lands, and seas, least with thy stars of all the galaxies, globed from the drift like these thou too shalt go. Thou art going hour by hour like these. Nothing abides. Thy seas in delicate haze go off, those mooned sands forsake their place, and where they are shall other seas in turn mow with their scythes of whiteness other bays. To astronomical evolution and dissolution, add the origin and elimination of species. Many monsters too the earth of old tried to produce, things of strange face and limbs, some without feet, some without hands, some without mouth, some without eyes. Every other monster of this kind earth would produce, but in vain. For nature set a ban on their increase. They could not reach the coveted flower of age, nor find food, nor be united in marriage. And many races of living things must then have died out, and been unable to beget and continue their breed. For in the case of all things which you see breathing the breath of life, Either craft or courage or speed has from the beginning of its existence protected and preserved each particular race. Those to whom nature has granted none of these qualities would lie exposed as a prey and booty to others until nature brought their kind to extinction. Nations, too, like individuals, slowly grow and surely die. Some nations wax, others wane, and in a brief space the races of living things are changed, and like runners hand over the lamp of life. In the face of warfare and inevitable death, there is no wisdom but in ataraxia, to look on all things with a mind at peace. Here, clearly, the old pagan joy of life is gone, and an almost exotic spirit touches a broken lyre. History, which is nothing if not humorous, was never so facetious as when she gave to this abstemious and epic pessimist the name of Epicurean. And if this is the spirit of the follower of Epicurus, imagine the exhilarating optimism of explicit Stoics like Aurelius or Epictetus. Nothing in all literature is so depressing as the dissertations of the slave, unless it be the meditations of the emperor. Seek not to have things happen as you choose them, but rather choose that they should happen as they do, and you shall live prosperously. No doubt one can in this manner dictate the future and play royal highness to the universe. Story has it that Epictetus's master, who treated him with consistent cruelty, one day took to twisting Epictetus's leg to pass the time away. "If you go on," said Epictetus calmly, "you will break my leg." The master went on, and the leg was broken. "Did I not tell you," Epictetus observed mildly, "that you would break my leg?" Yet there is a certain mystic nobility in this philosophy, as in the quiet courage of some Dostoevskian pacifist. Never in any case say, "I have lost such a thing," but "I have returned it." Is thy child dead? It is returned. Is thy wife dead? She is returned. Art thou deprived of thy estate? Is not this also returned? In such passages we feel the proximity of Christianity and its dauntless martyrs. Indeed, were not the Christian ethic of self-denial, the Christian political ideal of an almost communistic brotherhood of man, and the Christian eschatology of the final conflagration of all the world, fragments of Stoic doctrine floating on the stream of thought? In Epictetus, the Greco-Roman soul has lost its paganism and is ready for a new faith. His book had the distinction of being adopted as a religious manual by the early Christian Church. From these dissertations and Aurelius's meditations, there is but a step to the imitation of Christ. Meanwhile, the historical background was melting into newer scenes. There is a remarkable passage in Lucretius which describes the decay of agriculture in the Roman state and attributes it to the exhaustion of the soil. Whatever the cause, the wealth of Rome passed into poverty, the organization into disintegration, the power and pride into decadence and apathy. Cities faded back into the undistinguished hinterland. The roads fell into disrepair and no longer hummed with trade. The small families of the educated Romans were outbred by the vigorous and untutored German stocks that crept, year after year, across the frontier. Pagan culture yielded to Oriental cults, and almost imperceptibly, the empire passed into the papacy. The Church, supported in its earlier centuries by the emperors whose powers it gradually absorbed, grew rapidly in numbers, wealth, and range of influence. By the 13th century, it owned 1/3 of the soil of Europe, and its coffers bulged with donations of rich and poor. For 1,000 years it united, with the magic of an unvarying creed, most of the peoples of a continent. Never before or since was organization so widespread or so pacific. But this unity demanded, as the Church thought, a common faith exalted by supernatural sanctions beyond the changes and corrosions of time. Therefore, dogma, definite and defined, was cast like a shell over the adolescent mind of medieval Europe. It was within this shell that scholastic philosophy moved narrowly from faith to reason and back again, in a baffling circuit of uncriticized assumptions and preordained conclusions. In the 13th century, all Christendom was startled and stimulated by Arabic and Jewish translations of Aristotle, but the power of the Church was still adequate to secure, through Thomas Aquinas and others, the transmogrification of Aristotle into a medieval theologian. The result was subtlety, but not wisdom. The wit and mind of man, as Bacon put it, if it work upon the matter, worketh according to the stuff, and is limited thereby. But if it work upon itself, as the spider worketh his web, then it is endless, and bringeth forth indeed cobwebs of learning, admirable for the fineness of thread and work, but of no substance or profit. Sooner or later the intellect of Europe would burst out of this shell. After 1,000 years of tillage, the soil bloomed again. Goods were multiplied into a surplus that compelled trade, and trade at its crossroads built again great cities wherein men might cooperate to nourish culture and rebuild civilization. The Crusades opened the routes to the east and let in a stream of luxuries and heresies that doomed asceticism and dogma. Paper now came cheaply from Egypt, replacing the costly parchment that had made learning the monopoly of priests. Printing, which had long awaited an inexpensive medium, broke out like a liberated explosive and spread its destructive and clarifying influence everywhere. Brave mariners, armed now with compasses, ventured out into the wilderness of the sea and conquered man's ignorance of the earth. Patient observers, armed with telescopes, ventured out beyond the confines of dogma and conquered man's ignorance of the sky. Here and there, in universities and monasteries and hidden retreats, men ceased to dispute and began to search. Deviously, out of the effort to change baser metal into gold, alchemy was transmuted into chemistry. Out of astrology, men groped their way with timid boldness to astronomy, and out of the fables of speaking animals came the science of zoology. The awakening began with Roger Bacon, who died 1294. It grew with the limitless Leonardo, 1452 to 1519. It reached its fullness in the astronomy of Copernicus, 1473 to 1543, and Galileo, 1564 to 1642. In the researches of Gilbert, 1544 to 1603, in magnetism and electricity, of Vesalius, 1514 to 1564, in anatomy, and of Harvey, 1578 to 1657, on the circulation of the blood. As knowledge grew, fear decreased. Men thought less of worshipping the unknown and more of overcoming it. Every vital spirit was lifted up with a new confidence. Barriers were broken down. There was no bound now to what man might do. But that little vessels, like the celestial bodies, should sail round the whole globe is the happiness of our age. These times may justly use plus ultra, more beyond, where the ancients used non plus ultra. Bacon, The Advancement of Learning, Book 2, Chapter 10. A medieval motto showed a ship turning back at Gibraltar into the Mediterranean with the inscription non plus ultra, go no farther. It was an age of achievement, hope, and vigor, of new beginnings and enterprises in every field, an age that waited for a voice, some synthetic soul to sum up its spirit and resolve. It was Francis Bacon, the most powerful mind of modern times, who rang the bell that called the wits together and announced that Europe had come of age.